My name's Mark Ogge. I'm Principal Advisor at the Australian Institute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ogge. When you're ready.
No worries. I'd just like to thank the inquiry for giving us the opportunity to comment on the draft final report. We really appreciate it. I thought I'd just start by going through, quickly introducing the Australian Institute. So we're a not-for-profit NGO, and we've been doing work on climate and energy issues for over 20 years now. We've done a large body of research on unconventional gas impacts over the last 5 years. We published the National Emissions Audit, which is done by Hugh Sadler. We have a climate and energy program, which is taking on the work of the Climate Institute, which passed that work on to us recently. And we also commissioned 2 reports that the inquiry cites in the draft final report from the University of Melbourne, one a review of methane emissions and the other migratory emissions. And we've also submitted some work on the economic impacts to the inquiry as well. So, thank you for bringing us along. Well, I guess just right from to be clear at the start, our view is that that fracking in the Northern Territory shouldn't go ahead under any circumstances, because we believe it's going to have major climate impacts. And that it's just unconscionable to allow a whole new fossil fuel extraction industry, particularly on that scale, to go ahead. And I've just put there a couple of quotes from Ian Dunlop, who's the former head of the chair of the Australian Coal Association, the former CEO of the Institute of the Institute of Managers in Australia. He also led the government's task force on emission trading. So he's somebody who's, and he worked for years at Royal Dutch Shell internationally. So somebody who's not, who's very intensely into all of this stuff and comes from a very informed perspective, I guess. And this is his submission to the inquiry on the draft final report, and he says, in addressing the potential impact of Northern Territory fracking on global and regional climate change, it is fundamentally flawed, as it ignores the systematic existential risk that's now being locked in by global climate change in action. And then he's going on to say that, to suggest that the development of a major shale gas hydraulic fracturing industry in the Northern Territory would have negligible impact on climate warming, and that the associated emissions, whether figurative or life cycle, represent a medium risk of low consequences, demonstrates a serious failure to understand the existential nature of climate risk and its potentially catastrophic impact on the Northern Territory. And I think that, that's his view, but I think it kind of reflects my concern that climate change is a very a big danger at the moment, and I'm kind of wondering, I'm wondering whether the panel sort of acknowledges the magnitude of that risk. So on the slide at the moment, we've got projections from the IPCC that are looking at, by the end of the century, 4 to 6, even potentially up to 8-degree warming. And the World Bank has said that that's incompatible with an organised global community. So I'd just be interested,
it's incompatible with life.
And so in that context, approving a whole new fossil fuel industry of that scale seems kind of irresponsible to me. So I'd just like to understand whether the panel kind of, accepts those IPCC projections and the World Bank interpretation of those consequences.
We certainly do. I would have thought that it's not just incompatible with an organised global community. I would have thought it's incompatible with life.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Okay. No worries.
Nobody disputes the science.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So that just helps me understand a bit.
That's been stated very early on by the panel,
yes,
very clearly in relation to a number of people who have presented here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair. That's good. That's really comforting to hear. So just bringing it to the northern relevance to the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is particularly susceptible to climate impacts, And the Australian government has points out on the Environment Department website that currently there's 11 days in the Northern Territory over 35 degrees per year, and in 2070 that's likely to increase to, estimated to increase to 308 per year without strong action on reducing global warming. And you know, that combined with the increased humidity, etc., is just a bit of a terrifying thought, I would have thought, for Territorians. And heat waves kill more Australians than all other natural disasters combined. So I think it's a very real threat to the Northern Territory community in particular. So yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that that's the basis of our concern. There's a couple of just early things that that are kind of in the introduction before the greenhouse gas emissions chapter that I just wanted to point out. The first is that on page 5 of the report it says the shale gas revolution turned the US from an energy importer into an energy exporter. That's actually incorrect. The US still imports a lot of oil. It's reduced the amount of imports, but so that statement's incorrect, and that's a pretty kind of an important framing statement in the report. So we would suggest that it should say, the shale gas revolution did not turn the US from an energy importer to an energy exporter, just to be.
So you're saying it exports no gas? Oh, sorry, it exports no energy?
It exports a little bit. There's crude oil exports down there, but they're tiny. There's a green line at the bottom. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. No, there's a big... What you can't see is there's a big screen, huge screen in front of us.
Sorry. Okay. So the green line at the bottom is crude energy exports, and the blue... there's crude production and crude imports. So shale oil and shale gas means that they import less energy, but they still actually import a lot of energy into the US.
I don't think that's what that sentence says, though. It doesn't say that it doesn't import any energy.
Turn the US from an energy importer into an energy exporter.
It does both, does it not?
Yeah, but it implies, by saying it turned the US from an energy importer to an energy exporter, implies that there's a net export. Okay, then that's our interpretation. But
thank you for that clarification.
Okay, thanks. And similarly, shale gas is a form of natural gas. This is from the first few lines in the greenhouse gas section. Shale gas is a form of natural gas and is an important source of energy in the Australian energy market. We don't produce any shale gas at the moment, so it's not an important source of energy. So we think that should say that shale gas,
which is an important energy source.
Yeah. And I think that's important because it frames the whole tone of the report. So important in that sense. So the inquiry, so the draft final report takes the 365 petajoule a year shale gas field as the basis for all of its risk assessments. Now, and it finds that on that basis, the consequences, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions are low, therefore the consequences are low, therefore the risk is acceptable. So that single gas field in isolation, so just assuming that single gas field, would contribute, according to the report, around 5% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. So we, at the Australia Institute, we think that's an enormous amount of greenhouse gas to be produced by one shale gas field, or any shale gas field. And we think to increase Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by 5% is an appalling idea. So I would just like to ask whether the inquiry feels that it's okay, that it's a low consequence to increase Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. I'd just like to understand
This is, unfortunately, you're presenting to us. It's not a two-way conversation. So please continue with your presentation, Mr. Ogge.
Okay.
We do understand the point you're making, though.
Okay, yeah. But I do think it's also, you know, a situation like this is an important opportunity in terms of accountability and transparency for people to actually inquire into the...
We have we'll be doing a community forum in Darwin next Saturday from 9 till 12. That'll be much more of an open discussion Q&A. You're more than welcome to attend. We'll also be doing that type of format and discussion in Alice Springs, Catherine and Tennant. Again, you're more than welcome to attend any of those or all of those if you wish.
Okay, I think
I'll look forward to seeing you there.
It's difficult to ask in-depth questions in those kinds of situations, but I'll see if I can make it.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. So along the same lines, our Paris commitments are 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. And so I won't phrase it as a question then, but if we increase our emissions from the gas industry, then other industries have to pick that up. So, you know, the question is, should that be the manufacturing industry? Should that be the tourism industry? Should that be the agricultural industry? Like, somebody else has to shoulder that burden if we increase Australia's emissions by 5%. There's obviously the scenarios submitted by the DPIR, and they have the scenario that I think is 1,240 petajoules a year, which is the 3,400 petajoules a day, and that would have life cycle emissions, according to the report in table 9.4, of 98.8 million tonnes of emissions. And sure, some of that isn't burnt in Australia, or quite a lot of it, but putting the equivalent to almost 20% of Australia's emissions into the atmosphere is a very, is an enormously, I'd say, damaging thing to do that we think that we are very concerned about. So that's their so that's the DPI scenario. Now, the report based its entire risk assessment only on the isolated 325 petajoule a year gas field, and we think that's actually not consistent with the terms of reference, which say that the cumulative impacts and risks should be looked at. So there is a risk that the production levels could be higher than 365 petajoules a year. In fact, we think, our view is it's pretty likely when you throw in shale oil as well, and at the very least, a number of scenarios should have been looked at, and we don't think we think that's not in line with it doesn't fulfil the terms of reference. The other big question is there's no reference to shale oil. So in the US and in the US in particular, shale oil is a major driver of shale development over there. The Geoscience Australia think it's likely to be or could be a key driver of development here. There's a 4.7 billion barrel estimate from the EIA of shale gas in the Northern Territory, of shale oil in the Northern Territory, and liquids are very valuable, so they are a key driver in in development. So they can be, that can actually make it much more profitable and can actually drive development. So it seems really strange to us when, given the terms of reference, which don't say shale gas in particular, they say unconventional reservoirs. It's very strange. We think it's strange that the inquiry report is silent on shale oil. And this is I actually took this from Tim Forsey's submission, and that just gives a bunch. It's illustrative, so it just uses. It makes assumptions about the value of a barrel of oil and the value of a certain amount of gas, and it shows you, depending on how wet or dry the resource is that's being exploited, the difference in the value, the relative value of gas and liquids. So it's really, really important thing, I think. And I think it's also really worth pointing out that anyway, I just think it needs to be, before shale oil has a whole range of impacts and risks associated with it as well. So I think it's just...
You've read the terms of reference. You're aware that there's a particular definition given to unconventional reservoir that only picks up gas?
Okay, so does that... But is shale... Is oil not... I mean, is there some reason that it can't be extracted? Because there's
as you pointed out, we're unfortunately guided by our terms of reference. Okay. And I made exactly the same point to Origin this morning,
yes.
When other paths were begun to stray down, but the definition of unconventional reservoir limits us to shale gas only.
Well, I think that's really unfortunate, and also
we didn't draft them.
Yeah, no, and I accept that is a very unfortunate constraint. Maybe they'll need to hold another inquiry on that before that's allowed to go ahead. I mean, Origin...
I'm not volunteering to chair it.
I sympathise. But Origin are actively looking for, are actually targeting shale plays in the Northern Territory as well. Anyway, so on the 365 petajoule a year thing that the whole risk assessment was based on, we think, that's possible, but... Queensland, for instance, went from a standing start to 1,500 petajoules in under 8 years. And they don't have shale oil to make it even more profitable. The Marcellus Shale is a resource that's smaller than the Northern Territory resource, and that's doing 6,860 petajoules a year last year. So we think, our view is that the risk analysis should be done on the entire resource. We looked at the entire resource and we looked at over the lifetime of 250 odd thousand petajoules. The combustion emissions alone would be 12.2 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent, and you can see we've done we've assumed 5% fugitive emissions. You could make whatever assumption you like, but fugitive emissions increase that, could potentially increase that a lot. But the main point is that even if we assumed fugitive emissions are zero, we don't think this should go ahead because 12.2 billion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere is just unacceptable in our view. Now there's a few other things. That's kind of the guts of what I want to say, but there's a few things I really want to point out. There's a number of comparisons that we think are misleading or incorrect in the report. And one of them is that at the beginning of the report, for some reason, the draft report compares the methane emissions from natural gas production to the annual anthropogenic greenhouse warming effect of carbon dioxide, so all carbon dioxide. So for us it seems a strange comparison to take a subset of natural gas emissions and compare it to the entire carbon dioxide, output of carbon dioxide. You sure compare carbon dioxide to natural gas emissions, sure compare methane emissions globally to carbon dioxide emissions globally, but to take a small part of, arguably a small part of the natural gas emissions and compare it to all carbon dioxide emissions it seems like it's kind of a way to make methane emissions look small, and there's also not really a reason to, in the context of the report, to make that comparison on a global scale. But anyway, in our view, the calculation is in footnote 17, and it's got this equation 2.3% by 0.9% by 0.33%, and we take issue with all three of those numbers. The 2.3% is meant to be the effect of methane compared to the annual added climate effect of anthropogenic carbon dioxide greenhouse effect over the decade, and yet the report uses a global warming potential over 100 years, when the correct factor to use would be the 10-year global warming potential, because you've made the comparison over a decade, in which case the climate effect would be 7%, not 2.3%. And the other way you can calculate it is with radiative warming factor, and in which case the result would be 6%. The second figure is 0.9, and that 0.19 I should say, and that's that fossil fuel methane emissions make up a total of the proportion that they make up of total global methane emissions. So our issue with this is that it compares fossil fuel methane emissions. It compares fossil fuel methane emissions, including from natural sources, with anthropogenic CO2. So the more straightforward comparison would be to compare anthropogenic methane emissions with CO2 emissions. And if you did that, rather than fossil fuel emissions being 16% of, fossil fuel methane emissions being 16%, they'd be, I'm even confusing myself here, rather than being 19%, they'd be 32%. So we just think the comparison is flawed in that case. And the third figure, which is 0.33%, which is the percentage of fossil fuel methane emissions that come from natural gas, we think that shale oil should be included there, because we're talking about shale reservoirs that are going to have gas and oil, so we think the appropriate comparison there would be 2/3. So that really changes the equation. And the other thing that actually is the real clincher, and I've just taken this quote from Dimitri Lafleur's submission, who's one of the Melbourne University researchers. He says the most glaring omission, and that's in reference to this comparison, is that the effect of methane emissions from gas production are being compared to total global carbon dioxide emissions without acknowledging that 18.2% of the carbon dioxide emissions come from that same gas production. So the gas that is being burned, it's ignoring all the actual combustion emissions in that comparison that comes down to the 0.2%. So we don't think this entire comparison even is really relevant and needs to be in the report, but things like that, when you put it in, it frames the report and gives, we think, a misleading impression about the importance of methane emissions. It understates that all of those things consistently understate the impact of methane emissions on the world's climate. That's our concern with that. Look, this is probably going into the weeds a bit much, but it's kind of important. There's a section of the report that says that methane emissions from natural gas as a fraction of production have declined from approximately 8% to 2% over the last 3 decades. And this research has actually come out since the draft final report, but it's important that NOAA and NASA, in a report called Warden et al., reconciled the methane budget anomaly and found that actually fossil fuel methane's increased by 12 to 19 million tonnes a year. And it actually resolves the anomaly that the Schweizker et al. Report was referring to. I could talk in a little more detail, but it's probably just something to note, I think. Finally, really on the actual likely level of methane emissions, this is from our report that the draft report cites about a review of methane emissions from unconventional gas in Australia, and we compare the various levels of measured methane emissions, where methane's been measured in the atmosphere, to the factor-based emissions assumptions that are used based on the American Petroleum Institute compendium and other sources. and you can see that there's some of them ranges, but the basic point is that every time they fly they figure out a theoretical factor-based likely level of emissions, and then every time they fly a plane over these shale fields, they find actual leakage rates that are far, far higher, higher to the point of being pretty scary, up to 17%. Now, the draft final report essentially dismisses this, the higher readings, and what it says is, in particular, it is difficult, if not almost impossible, to distinguish between many sources of emissions when considering the results from top-down investigations. So it's essentially dismissing all of those higher measured emissions in favour of the factor-based ones that aren't measured. They're based on assumptions. But the thing is, that statement is actually incorrect to say that it's almost impossible to distinguish between the many sources of emissions. All of those reports that we cite do exactly that. They go into great detail to distinguish between the various sources of emissions. And I'm just pulling out one example here. You can look at more in our submission. But Frankenberg et al. 2016 used top-down infrared imaging to be able to accurately identify individual methane plumes as small as 2 kilograms per hour. Right? So the statement that it's impossible or difficult to actually identify the sources of the emissions is inaccurate. And if you look in detail at those reports, or just look at these photos where they can actually pinpoint them to, pipelines, processing plants, well pads, etc. So you can't, we think it's pretty clear that you can't just dismiss all the measured stuff and assume that the theoretical bottom-up measurement is correct. Okay, that stuff, and the classic example is actually Allen et al., which is one of the biggest studies of bottom-up ever done. They did it, there's details in our submission, but they measured a huge amount of well pads and processing plants and valves and, widgets all over the place. And they came up, I think, with 1.8% leakage rate. And then they were found to have misinterpreted their measuring equipment and were out by a factor of 3 to 5, right? That's proven. That is shown to be the case. Nobody has disproven these top-down atmospheric measuring that are undertaken by the NOAA and a whole lot of very, very highly regarded organisations. So our recommendation is, I've actually missed a slide there, but just to kind of make it clear what we could be talking about in terms of a comparison that we've been making in terms of the total resource. If you burnt that total resource, which essentially is on its way to happening in the case of the Marcellus Shale, it'd be the equivalent to building, depending on your assumptions on fugitive emissions, somewhere between 50 and 130 coal power plants in Australia. Right? No one would ever consider doing that. And no one should ever consider, opening up this resource for exactly the same reason. So our recommendation is that the development of gas fields in the Northern Territory should not go ahead under any circumstances, regardless of the level of fugitive emissions from hydraulic fracking operations. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ogge, have you got, are those slides what was delivered very late to the inquiry yesterday, on Sunday?
The slides I just brought in on a USB.
Right.
But the report, and apologies it's so late, but the report was delivered late on Sunday.
No, that's fine. I'm glad we've received it. That's the main thing. So we have got a copy of your slides as well.
Oh, yes, you do, yes.
All right, okay. Yes, thank you. Questions? Yes, Dr. Beck.
Yes, just a couple of questions, observations. You're making the point of saying, I think, in your concluding statement that you shouldn't go ahead and utilise all of the resource that's available in the Northern Territory.
Well, we don't think the industry should be allowed to go ahead because it's unpredictable. It's likely to be massive. Okay.
Now, in terms of the numbers that you're using 257 odd thousand petajoules as the resource.
Yes.
Now, in table, I think it's 6.1, it talks about a reserve and then contingent resources and prospective resources. Are you aware of the differences between those?
Yeah, yes, I am.
So,
2P and 2C and prospective, all of that.
So the 257,000 petajoules represents which category?
The
of
total resource.
Total resource.
Well, I think. Sorry, I've taken the 250. I didn't see table 6.1. I was looking at chapter 9 on the greenhouse gas emissions for the most part.
In your submission, you've quoted 257,000 petajoules as the resource.
Yes.
And that resource, I think, is a what's called a prospective resource.
Yes, that's correct.
And a prospective resource, so just so we're talking the same thing.
Yeah.
There's a reserve which are approved.
Yes.
There are contingent resources.
Yes.
Which are not yet commercially available, not yet commercial because of need of further development of technical or better economic conditions. And then the third category is one that I think you've used, which is prospective, and that's based upon speculative data, and so there's a high level of uncertainty attached to it, is the first thing. Second thing is that there is a very large ratio between contingent resources and prospective resources. And just taking the example of table 6.1, there's a factor of at least 50 times the difference level in resources. So just trying to put some context around it. I'm wondering, have you any sort of indication of what that would do to Australia's production if we used all of the contingent resource that you're talking about, 250,000 petajoules over a 50-year period? Yeah,
that's the 12.2 billion tonnes of CO2.
Yeah. And in terms of Australia's current use of gas, averaged over a 50-year period, that represents more than 100% of Australia's current usage of gas.
Yeah, it's assumed that most would be exported. I mean, that's the assumption that the inquiry uses as well. I mean, the DPIR...
We haven't made any assumptions in regard to utilisation of 250,000 petajoules. That's your assumption, that you're saying that all of that resource will be used. And certainly that is it's a prospective resource, and there's no guarantee that there will be that amount of resource available to be actually extracted under technical and commercial conditions.
Yeah, so to be clear, we're not saying that 250,000 petajoules would definitely be extracted and burnt. We don't know what's going to happen. The comparison I'm making is that in the case of... So that's an unknown, and with reserves, as I'm sure you're aware, you know, a couple of years ago, everything was prospective reserves in the Northern Territory. And as time goes on, they get proved up, and the prospective reserves turn into contingent reserves, the prospective resource turns into contingent reserves, turns into proven reserves, and, you know, may get exploited. And more gas is sometimes discovered and added to the prospective reserve. For instance, before about 15 years ago, nobody would have thought any of this gas could have been extracted because the technology didn't exist. So the resource could actually end up being greater in theory. I mean, let's hope not, but I agree. What I'm saying is I completely agree with you that it's an unknown. But if you're doing a risk assessment, you need to base the risk assessment on the figure that you cite as being the resource, because it's not saying that would all be extracted, but there is a risk that would all be extracted, or a large part of it would be extracted. And the figures we're putting up there is we're saying this is what it could be if over time that was extracted, and to support that, and to just kind of illustrate the that is actually a real danger, I've mentioned that the CSG in Queensland went from a standing start to 1,500 petajoules a year in 7 years, and that resource is they're like all put together resource, including prospective and contingent and proven, is about 130 petajoules at the moment. Marcellus Shale is their resource. It's always difficult to completely compare figures, but the figures that we've looked at for Marcellus in the US is a bit smaller than what's thought to be in the Northern Territory, and they're doing 6,800 petajoules a year. So, and they don't export, So we're not saying that it will all definitely be exploited, but we're saying the inquiry needs to include that the range of possibilities in the risk assessment, not base it all on one isolated gas field that may or may not end up being the production at some particular point in time.
I think in your presentation you may have used some slides from Mr. Forsey, and I think so you showed the slides where all of that resource was being used, and you were making predictions that they would be the emissions. So I think at least it appeared to me in the presentation that you were working on the assumption all of that resource would be used. All the contingent resources that are defined.
Well, I'm sorry if I gave that impression. I hoped I was being more clear, but what we're trying to show is that's the resource that's been identified, and Tim would agree, I work with Tim a lot, Tim would agree with that assessment that he's saying it wouldn't necessarily all be extracted, but it could well all be extracted. And so here's what it looks like if you extract it all. But he's not discounting the possibility.
Says that in your submission, though.
It doesn't, no. To that extent, would you agree that your submission's a little misleading? Insofar as it's not expressed as clearly as it could be?
Well, I'm very happy to go back and have another look. I can't remember the exact wording off the top of my head, but I'm certain that I wouldn't have said that we believe the entire resource will be extracted. We're saying this is the size of the resource, and if it was extracted and burnt, this would be the resulting emissions. I mean, if it turns out to be half that, it would still be a disaster. But we're trying to get across the scale of the risk.
Yes, and as I sort of noted, that if it was all extracted over a 50-year period, then it's greater than Australia's current usage of gas, which is both domestic and export.
So the Queensland CSG, within 7 years, was triple the amount of Australia's domestic use. And you have an international market, you can just keep building LNG terminals.
I don't think it's tripled our domestic use.
Well,
I think it may have tripled our total gas production. The domestic use has remained reasonably constant.
Yeah. Sorry, it's triple production. So it's the exports are double our domestic use, which is around 500 or 600 petajoules a year. But I guess the point I'm making is that our domestic use is no guide to the market when you're opened up to global exports of LNG.
And I'll just make one other observation and let other people have an opportunity to comment. I think you went through and made some observations about the applicability of some of the analysis, and you're starting at the 2.3%. I would have to disagree quite strongly with a number of the assertions that you've made in the submission and in the presentation. They are technical, and I'm happy to have some discussions at a later juncture, but I just want to put on record that I disagree with that analysis.
Okay, I'm very happy to follow that up with you, Dr. Vaughan. Dr. Beck.
Dr. Ritchie?
Oh, thank you. Look, I mean, I can just say the panel certainly appreciates having the Australia Institute able to apply what we expect to be a at least to an extent possible, a disinterested look at the data and get to the bottom of some very complex issues. The fact that the Institute has reached a conclusion that it is as you basically the main point of your submission to us today, that it is you completely believe that it's an unacceptable risk under any circumstances to develop this resource. That we have a kind of a problem matching how to then deal with your economic analysis, because you seem to have taken very much the high end of looking at what could the worst case scenario, which would, if eventuated, would in fact make it extremely profitable. And yet in the economic report, your argument is that it's basically it's a marginal economic proposal. And I'd just invite you to perhaps reconcile the two reports.
Sure. Well, I'm sure Rod would be really happy to go through the economic impacts in detail. I didn't do that, but the main point is that ACIL report, as far as I can see, excluded shale oil from its analysis.
For the reasons I've explained.
For the reasons you've explained. Now, if shale oil is the key driver of, Rod actually wasn't, I don't think I shouldn't speak for Rod actually, but as far as I know, he hadn't looked at the implications for shale oil. But shale oil, if these basins are open up, shale oil is going to be a big part of it, probably, quite possibly the key driver, and the ACIL analysis completely excluded it. So when I realised that shale oil had come into play, that changes it.
I understand that, but it's the other way around, though, isn't it? That if there's shale oil, it becomes incredibly profitable. Yeah. Yeah. So in other words, the economic analysis that you provide. I mean, we as a panel have been grappling with why do this. We're very aware and conscious of the risks involved, and so we're looking at any risk has got to be matched by what benefit is there, and that was the basis of us commissioning the ACIL report. Your economic analysis has said that on the basis of that, it's probably even more marginal the benefit than the report, and yet as with your presentation here is, actually, it's a very, very highly valuable resource, at least in a short-term economic sense, yet has catastrophic, as you would put it, environmental consequences.
Yeah. So
can't be both, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yes, and who knows how the market plays out in the end. It's all speculation by any of us. But what I would say is that and I haven't looked at it in a huge amount of detail, but the Gale scenario, that Gale scenario, best case is, I think, a peak of 530 jobs a year, right? And so if that's your best case, that's in the overall scheme of jobs in the Northern Territory or in Australia, that's quite small for an industry. It's quite small. The gas industry is very good at getting the resource out of the ground and to market without using very many people. And so maybe the Gale thing is the outcome. Maybe it's even more than that. But if 530 people is your best case, and remember, if you think that's going to be Territorians, when you've got a whole experienced industry winding down in Queensland, I would say that it's likely that very few of those will actually be Territorians. There's also,
I really do understand that.
Yeah.
My point is that in your analysis of our dealing with the environmental risks, you have made a point that our terms of reference cast some doubt about our ability to make a sound finding because it doesn't include oil. Yes. You did not make that point in your economic analysis.
No, because at that stage when Rod did that work, we hadn't clocked it. I didn't start my work on it until after we'd made that submission.
Okay.
So So that's why it started ringing alarm bells for me.
So just to be clear,
Yeah.
you would say, well, the economic analysis may in fact turn out to be a much brighter economical analysis, and the environmental consequences considerably higher.
Yeah, I think the economics could be brighter for the gas industry, for sure, but I don't think that many of those benefits pass on to the local economy. And also I think there's a couple of things that are really important to remember, and one is that there's a displacement effect with gas development, and that's been clocked throughout every gas development ever, knocks out other industries. And you have to also think about the truck movements, things like the truck movements from, not just from fracking, but from oil, where they actually use tankers to get oil. Like, I'm just imagining what that's going to do to other industries in the Northern Territory. So, you know, sure, maybe, you know, I'm just saying, even if you get your gale, as I'm suggesting, is a risk here. The economic benefits are you know, definitely not as rosy as they're being painted.
Yes, Professor Hart.
I had just one. You've obviously focused on greenhouse gas aspects. I was just wondering whether the Australia Institute has any other views on some of the other potential risks of a shale gas industry, water, land, cultural. We don't have the luxury of only viewing one aspect.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, I guess I'm not speaking to a specific piece of research here. I've got, you know, views on it. I think it's well documented overseas. There's a lot of cases of, you know, contamination of water resources. There's been a lot of mishaps, a lot of explosions, a lot of cases of contamination. There's big questions over health. I think there's a whole lot of other risks that concern me. I think it often badly impacts other. I mean, one thing I am really aware of, because I travel a lot talking in communities that are actually dealing with this in Queensland, and it has a big impact on existing industries. So I think it's you know,
that's coal seam gas.
Yes.
We're talking shale.
No, but I don't have an Australian comparison to that. So, but the elements of the industry that cause the issues in Queensland, like, you know, the workers' camps, the FIFO, the kind of boom and bust cycle to small economies, the crowding out of agriculture, the taking up of transport capacity, all of those kinds of things are the same whether it's shale or CSG. Possibly worse with CSG, just with shale, because you've got to move a whole lot more water and fracking fluids around, etc. But yeah, there's, you know, we've done some research on the local economic impacts, and I think that there's worries there. But my area of water and health and stuff like that really aren't my area of expertise.
Thank you.
Any further questions? I just wanted to clarify one thing that you said on your slides. It's in your submission that certainly we did say that development of the single shale gas field in isolation would increase Australia's greenhouse gases by 5%. You've given a reference there. Then you've gone on and said, quote, incredibly, the inquiry concludes this as a low consequence and acceptable risk. Now, I'm just struggling to see where you get that information from, given at 9.6 the risk is described, or at least is assessed as medium, as it is at 9.6.2 medium. And then when you go to the back of the chapter, it certainly talks about a mitigated risk being achieved with after mitigation measures are deemed to achieve an acceptable risk. Did you want to clarify what you've said in your submission to us?
So low consequences, and what? So
medium. We've come up with a medium, unmitigated. risk.
Okay. But the acceptable risk is mitigated.
Yeah.
That,
You haven't,
I could
you haven't
have
stated
misread
that.
I was. I could,
Is
could be
that
an error
another
on my part.
illustration of where you've perhaps been a bit misleading?
It might be. It might be. I'll need to look at it, but it could be. It could be a mistake. But for me, the key thing is that the consequences are considered low.
You'd also have to agree with me that nowhere do we recommend approval of an unconventional gas development, do we?
Did I say that?
Yes, you have in your executive summary.
So I think the overall gist of the draft report is to effectively recommend that it would be approved.
Nowhere in our report, in any report, in anything we've published, have we ever recommended that this industry be approved, have we?
We are not at the stage of making a formal recommendation to the government at the moment, but
I said published material. Nowhere, let me repeat the question again.
No, that's true.
Thank you. And I can assure you that nowhere will we do so. Thank you, Mr. Ogge, for your detailed submissions, and we look forward to further discussions and further points of clarification in your material. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.